Welcome to Cultivate, a Veritas Academy podcast, where we explore truth, beauty, and goodness through meaningful conversation. We invite you to join us in discussions meant to edify your mind, encourage your heart, and equip your family to live abundantly in Christ.
Welcome back to Cultivate. I'm Ty Fisher, your host, and I am here today with one of our Omnibus teachers, Pastor Paul Miller from the Hopeland United Methodist Church. Now, Pastor Miller is a Methodist pastor teaching here at Veritas Academy. He's our version of Whitfield here. So, Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, this is absolutely my privilege to be a part of this. And when the question came across and the topic came through, this was a no-brainer.
Yeah. Now, some of you know Paul, and many of you probably don't. He teaches in our 7th and 8th grade secondary omnibus classes. Is that correct?
Correct. And 11th now, too.
11th grade as well. So, but the kind of the linchpin of secondary omnibus 7th and 8th, those 2 years really circle around Narnia and the Lord of the Rings. And, when classical education started, the resurgence out at Moscow, Idaho, they didn't pay their teachers for 2 years. They just left like canned goods out on the porch and stuff like that. And I think if I offered Paul just canned goods, if he would talk about Lewis and Tolkein with students, would you take that?
I probably would. If you seem like you know me pretty well at this point.
So I always cause problems at family get-togethers because I ask this question. I say, is there anything that's been written in the last 200 years that will be read 500 years from now? Okay, you think about like Homer is working on, 3,000 years or something like that? Dante is working on 700 years. It's mainly to draw out people to have an argument about Harry Potter, because there's some people that think Harry Potter is going to be read 500 years from now, and I'm like, he's not going to be read 500 days from now.
Oh, that's a hot take.
No. But he's not. It's not going to last. So and I say there's really only one that I'm sure about, and that's the works of Jane Austen. I think that there's no way those are going away. But then there's Lewis and Tolkein. Why are Lewis and Tolkein so important to Christians today?
Well, you're asking kind of like the bold more like the
why not start at the top? Why not start at the top of the mountain?
Why are they so important today? Well, in one sense, Lewis was very, very good at describing this in terms of what will pay dividends over a long time period. And the way that he would value a book wasn't the impact that it made in that society in that moment, or even within your own life. The best way to value and to show a book's value is to see how it will impact you over the course of your entire life. Does it continue to pay you dividends the more you read it? Can I read Beatrix Potter at 80 years old and still get something that I didn't get out of it whenever I was 4, or at least something that's just as worthy of consideration? Yeah. Now, Lewis was asking about that. I mean, I don't know too many people that would say that they still consider The Wind in the Willows to be among the most timeless classics of all time, in the same way that you would say the works of Jane Austen.
Yeah.
But apparently Lewis was one of those guys who did. He would value books based on his own personal experience and the way that they would impact him.
Well, in that, when we think about Narnia especially, because that's so many, Lewis he's written so much more, theological works and other works of fiction, but Narnia is often the gateway drug into C.S. Lewis, right?
Yeah.
You go through that wardrobe, and that you're pretty much a Lewis fan at that point. So how did you get started with C.S. Lewis?
That's a fun question. To go over that, I'll be very brief in this. I know pastors have a history of being long-winded. But
that is correct.
I do my best not to be, but I do have to go a little bit further back. I didn't grow up in the church at all.
Okay.
So in that way, I feel like I reflect some of what Lewis went through as he was growing up. In fact, the most I knew about Christianity till I was about 18 years old was the Charlie Brown Christmas special.
That's a really great segue into Christianity. But if that's it, that's
Yeah, you get a beautiful Linus, beautiful thing, but that was the most. I couldn't tell you the difference between a Catholic, a Protestant, or a Mennonite. I couldn't tell you the difference.
Wow.
Didn't know. But whenever I finally did start going to church, it was through a lot of reading, a lot of study. And what I found was that over time, some of the questions I was asking in my head weren't being answered.
okay.
And I didn't necessarily know where to go for those answers. And through a long series of steps, it took way longer than it should have, a year, I finally came across this term, apologetics.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it took a full year. Lord kept me from it for whatever reason in his providence. And what ended up happening was I asked this, I almost dumbfounded. I said, do you mean there's people that ask these questions like I am? And somebody immediately said,
You thought you were all alone.
I honestly did. I was just surprised. And the moment I began to ask that and describe that kind of surprise, someone said, you should read Mere Christianity.
So it wasn't Narnia for you.
No.
Mere Christianity was the first work of Lewis that you read.
That was the very first ground zero.
How many pages were you in before you were hooked?
I think I got about through the prologue.
Yeah.
The introduction as he's describing his terms, laying out what he's going to say, what's important, why he's doing this, who he's asked to proofread his work, all those things. Very, very, very impressive. And from then on, and all it took was through the first part of the next section, and I was absolutely hooked at that point.
Yeah. Lewis's essays, even when I disagree with him, when I read them, I think he's right. He pins me so easily. So when you think about the Narnia Chronicles, especially, because that's what you're focusing on in 7th grade here, which of the Narnia Chronicles is your favorite and why?
You know, it's funny. This is one of the questions that comes up with 7th graders. There's many 7th graders that come in and have already read the Chronicles of Narnia. Mr. Miller, you're not going to surprise me. There's nothing new that you could probably teach me about this. I hope to instill that same fear, maybe. Yeah. But what I think people are surprised, and most of the students are surprised to hear that it is the Magician's Nephew that is my favorite.
Really?
Yeah.
For what reason?
Lewis has a brilliant way of evoking creation in heaven. Lewis struggles, and you notice with evangelical Christianity, can get himself into trouble when he's talking about hell.
Okay.
But whenever it comes to heaven, and the way that things are described. In fact, it's always seems to be described in terms of his childhood. Belfast, Ireland, beautiful green hills, blue skies, trees, these things. He always seems to describe heaven in terms of his childhood and what he grew up with. And I think that it is his ability to evoke that kind of joy that really connects me to the Magician's Nephew more than anything else.
Okay. So you're talking about that heaven is like childhood a little bit, or at least for Lewis it is. And, you know, I'm out at dismissal sometimes, and I see these happy kids running to the buses, and they're not running because they're racing, and they're not running because someone's chasing them. They're just running because running's fun for kids to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I hope heaven is like. running just for the joy of it.
Running to get away from school, right?
Right. Well, they seem happy about the work they're doing at school too. So
I have a first grader here. I can vouch for it. Okay. He's happy every day.
Good. So why do kids love the Narnia books so much? Is it because, you know, I've kind of have a theory on this, is that they feed you at a deeper and deeper level as you grow up. So my first reading of the Narnia books was just as you know, animal tales and stuff like that. And then you just keep on digging down. So why do you think kids love it so much?
There's definitely a part of that, at least in the long run. That's what I was describing with the dividends that it will continue to pay. I think that's a testament to Narnia's long-term success. But I think one of the reasons that children enjoy it as much as they do is because Lewis had a way of talking to children at their level, which is very different. Douglas Gresham, his stepson, actually talks about this. He recalls that Lewis never really talked down to children. He came down to their level and talked to them,
which is which is brilliant, by the way.
Brilliant and difficult.
Yeah.
Difficult to do, especially. But it's strange that it's so difficult for us as adults. We were children at one point.
Did you know that our first Latin teacher at Veritas Academy, the job he had before he took the Latin job here, he was Douglas Gresham's personal assistant?
No way.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Oh, that is wild.
Yeah. The second Latin teacher was Jean Edward Veith's daughter, Joanna. So, yeah. I'm going to pivot a little bit here to The Lord of the Rings. Who's your favorite character in The Lord of the Rings and why?
I've bounced back on this, and I think I have a different answer. There's only ever two that come up for me in my head. And they're two of maybe the character. One of them might be a little obvious. I think some people agree with me, and the other one not so much. The more obvious one, I think, is Gollum.
Okay.
I find Gollum and his character arc, particularly as you hit the end of the Two Towers, he has this one moment for redemption where he has an interaction with Sam. Sam's asleep, and you just feel Tolkien opening up about him. Yeah. It is just, and actually, from what I understand, I haven't heard the interview or read any papers, but I've read enough people cite it that apparently Tolkien said that he openly wept whenever he wrote that scene.
Wow.
Yeah, for his book, and that stuck with me. And it's
that's that back and forth.
It's actually a little bit later. He's coming along, and Sam and Frodo are both asleep, and it just describes him as that light, that green, envious light going out of his eyes. And then a couple seconds later, he's not so much looking like Gollum, this monster that's been chasing after this ring, but he looks almost like a sad, tired hobbit, long surviving, long past his years.
Yeah.
And he has this moment where redemption is almost within grasp, and Sam wakes up and snaps and, "What are you doing, you old villain?" That kind of reaction, and immediately Gollum goes back into it. And I think that it might be that interaction that Gollum has with redemption, and redemption almost being snatched away. It strikes me as very poetic. That's why.
Wow. Did you follow that court case in Turkey where the journalist compared their president Erdogan? He was arrested for comparing Erdogan to Gollum. And his lawyer made the defense that Gollum is the hero of The Lord of the Rings because he destroyed the ring. So they actually let him off.
That's funny. I actually asked that of the students at least once on one quiz for every single one of the books of The Lord of the Rings. Not The Hobbit, because he's not there, but he is there, but there's some funny stuff that Tolkien did with even Gollum in The Hobbit.
Yeah.
But I asked my students who is the hero of The Lord of the Rings? And it's not a question that is a hard answer. I want them to sell me. Mm-hmm. They need to sell me on it.
Part of classical education is reasoning and persuading.
Yep.
So you had one favorite character. What's your other favorite character?
This is a little surprising. Faramir.
Faramir. Oh, it's not surprising.
Interesting. Okay, well, I'm glad you're not surprised by him. I find him to be fascinating.
He's a flawless man.
That's exactly why.
Nah. So we're going to talk about the movies and the books.
Because,
yes, we're going to touch the hot stove, but I don't like him in the movies.
No.
But in the books, he's the man.
He's Boromir Unfallen. Or I shouldn't say that. He's Boromir as if Boromir were to always, if he would have actually held his oath and held it properly. In some sense, like he is what Boromir should have been had he actually succeeded in what he did. Now, there's other parts to him, but I often wonder, and I've got nothing to go off on this. This is pure Miller speculation here. Whether or not Tolkien decided, maybe I didn't do this exactly right. Maybe I do want to add a character in the editing process that can show us what this will look like properly.
Wow.
Just speculation.
Okay.
There's nothing to go off on that.
So what do you think about the movies, the Peter Jackson movies? Let's cut off a few of the things just at one. I'm just talking about not the Hobbit movies. I feel like they're dreadful.
Yeah.
Mainly because in the Hobbit movies, they're taking a little book and trying to stretch it out so that they can get a gold hoard, by the way. It's all for money.
Yeah, they have their own Arkenstone in sight. Yeah.
Right. Whereas the Rings trilogy, they're taking a massive work, and they can't even really get all of it in.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about the movies?
I think Peter Jackson's movies, man, how do I answer this appropriately? I think The Fellowship of the Ring was very strong.
Okay.
Very strong. It was a little more dramatic in some places, but I don't think it did anything against the flair of it. Where I struggle with the Jackson Lord of the Rings films really starts in The Two Towers.
Okay.
Theoden, Faramir, these
Yep.
characters that appear and are major characters and almost flawless. Like, okay, Theoden, completely taken in by Wormtongue, absolutely like corrupted. But when in the books, whenever he's brought out of this, there's no hesitation as to what the right thing to do is. He
Yeah.
knows as a king, this is what is righteousness. Like, I need to do this for the sake of my people.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense of duty there that is completely unchecked by maybe even prudence in some ways. I think that it might be some of what Tolkien's doing there is to say that there are times whenever prudence needs to give way to what is right.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's a great insight. So there are times when if you're going to think the whole thing out and just figure out what the next safe step is, what Tolkien is saying there is that's not what a king does.
No.
A king says, even though we have very little chance of success, I know what righteousness is.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to step forward and do it.
Yeah. Whereas Peter Jackson portrays him as almost a villain in his own movie at times.
Yeah.
He's always, no, we're going to do this. I know you thought that this was the right idea, Gandalf, but we're going to instead run to Helm's Deep. And meanwhile, in the book, it's Gandalf's like, yeah, this makes perfect sense. Let's go to Helm's Deep.
Yeah.
They seem to just put Theoden in his own way. And I can't figure out a thematic reason other than to just drive up a sense of drama that just was not there in the books.
Yeah. And then Return of the King?
Yeah, it gets a little hairier there for me. For one thing, between those, I look at Gollum, and I believe the scene that I described with Gollum was played for laughs in that movie. And it hurts whenever I see something that was so powerful and has this redemptive arc to it, or redemptive possibility just being played off for laughs. Faramir is another thing. I mean, Faramir is Boromir uncorrupted, successful in his vow and in his promises. And
in the movie, it's like Boromir unmanned.
Yeah, it's like, well, let's make him, he'll be younger, a little less ambitious, and therefore he won't fall into the same problems.
Yeah.
Which is not the way he's described. And Faramir in the books is just, he's a paragon.
Yeah.
A paragon of virtue.
Well, and I love the movies. I tell people every time I get sick,
Yes.
I watch the Lord of the Rings extended edition, and I've always gotten well. And I went to the Hobbit movies one time, and I got sick. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's completely scientific, but there you go.
I can relate to that. No, I think the Jackson movies have far more going for them than they have going against them.
The big thing, of course, that is missing in the Return of the King, and it really, it breaks what Tolkien was doing in the Rings trilogy, is the scouring of the Shire.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, is where the scouring of the Shire is where this whole thing goes.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not the reason that you go on this quest and destroy the Ring of Power and save Middle Earth is really so that you're prepared to go back to your community and be the kind of people that you're supposed to be. I think we needed that part in the Jackson movie for the COVID time. There was a lot of orc talk going on during COVID.
Quite a bit, yeah. I could see that. Yeah, I would agree with you. Scouring of the Shire seems to be conspicuously missing.
The movies are so long. I just think there's no way to put it in, but it really Tolkien is headed in a direction, and Jackson never arrives at the port.
No, there's a reality of war that's missing from it as a result. Also, we think about soldiers going to war, winning, coming back, and resuming their lives. Well, very often, whenever you go into an area and you drive evil out, it's got to go somewhere.
Yes.
And it's not always destroyed. And if there is lingering evil, sometimes it will end up back in your community.
Yeah.
And not even just coming there. You may find that evil in a vacuum. Whenever there's good holding it down, finally, when that good's gone, it has the opportunity to grow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you miss a lot by missing the scouring.
So have you watched any of this new stuff, the Rings of Power?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Okay. So what's your opinion on it before I give mine? You can't curse.
Okay. Well, no, I wouldn't.
You're a pastor.
The way I've described it to your students, then, my students, it's not a dumpster fire.
Okay.
That's what it said. I'll say that. I expected to be raked over the coals.
Okay.
And I'm pleasantly surprised that I'm not.
Okay.
I'll give it a second season, but you can tell that there's a lot more 20th century story writing going on to this. And the reason I say 20th century, I mean, yes, Tolkien wrote, or I should say 21st century story writing, if that's the case. There's a lot more 21st century story writing going into it because it's very character-driven, character growth-driven, not there's a bad guy, there's an army, there's a duty that must be done. It's not duty-driven, it's character-driven. I don't even know if that necessarily gets it right, but I think you see where I'm going.
And I'm my Silmarillion knowledge is not as tight as my Rings knowledge or Hobbit knowledge, but I watched the first episode and again, I was like praying that this is not Tolkien being turned into the Game of Thrones or something like that, or just done horrible things with. And I left the first episode and I was like, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. But there was the Galadriel that I was seeing there. I just couldn't go back for a second episode because she is like the pinnacle of feminine virtue. Mm-hmm. And he's turning her into a warrior. And I just like, that's not like, I have 4 daughters and I just don't want them to think that the only way to be virtuous is to be masculine.
Yeah.
Because Galadriel's power, in Lord of the Rings is not, she's not going to come and punch you in the mouth.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean she's not powerful.
Yeah, I agree with you. If I could, if I said it wasn't a dumpster fire, I could say it almost was with her. Her personality for me in that story was really rough to watch because they both seem, I should say Kate Blanchett and I forget the actress's name for this. I feel awful about that, but they both have a stare about them. And Kate's is very piercing. Mm-hmm. It's not mean-spirited. It seems to be tempered by wisdom. Mm-hmm. And I think she nailed the look, how you can do a look. The new Galadriel, I feel like she's almost looking down on the rest of the world. And maybe that's done on purpose.
Yeah.
It could be this character.
She's like a super ninja.
Yeah, there's that also. I don't think she's ever described anywhere as the kind of Xena warrior princess that we all know. But yeah.
Yeah, that scene in the Jackson movies, and I don't remember this in the book, so I hope it's there, but where Frodo falls down and he had that vision of Galadriel just helping them up and saying, if you don't do this, no one's going to do it. Come on. And that's the kind of encouragement that Middle Earth wouldn't have been saved without it. But it's not a ninja fighting kind of power.
And this could be something that the character grows into in the Amazon series. It's possible. I like to give the benefit of the doubt more than I don't. Yeah. But I said I'll
You're
be
a nicer guy than I am.
Yeah, I get it. I've been told too nice at times, particularly to fictional characters.
Well, so sometimes, you're not only a teacher, you're a pastor. Mm-hmm. Sometimes Christians get sideways with especially the fictional stuff in Lewis and in the Lord of the Rings, because there are wizards and dragons and magic. When you have a congregant or a student who might tend to want to say, push away these books because of that, how do you deal with that kind of objection?
Well, the first answer is that I'm not sure that anything that I say is going to change anybody's opinion anymore. We're a very staunch part of the guy. If somebody's coming, Pastor Paul, I'm torn. And they're genuinely torn. Should I read this or should I not? I can speak into that.
Yeah.
But more often than not, our society comes in, how could you read something like that? How could you encourage that? And it's oh boy, this conversation's starting off wonderful. For people that are genuinely sideways on it, though, I do try to make it a little, I try to play some replacement games with some of the words.
Okay.
So dragons aren't so much a problem. I mean, you have dragons in almost every culture on every continent in the entire world. For some reason, we don't reject dragons like we do wizards.
Yes, that's true.
And believe me, this is not equivalent. And I realize that even as I'm saying, this is just an analogy that will fall apart under enough scrutiny, but it's just enough to get the conversation going. If you take wizards and change it to prophets and magic to miracles, does the story change for you? And if the answer is no, you have a problem.
Because the Bible's full of that other stuff, right?
Exactly. And if there, let's say we had we do this kind of thing in translation and all sorts of stuff with scripture, and whenever we try to come up with the best words to get the point across.
Yep.
Wizards and magic have an evocative. Again, this will fall apart under enough scrutiny.
Yeah.
But what I try to do is to get them to say, what is it behind? What is it that you're really worried about? Because let's be fair here, there is no such thing as a real wizard in the way that this story is portraying it. And while we will say that, yes, there are people that have probably used dark powers to lord power over their friends and family, that's not exactly what's going on here. It's not glamorizing. Not often. There are some that definitely do. And that's where I believe prudence plays in so much into this.
How has reading these books helped you as a pastor?
Well, it helped me become one. Mere Christianity was just the start. And once I began to go through some of his other books, particularly Miracles was my favorite book of Lewis's apologetic work. Anybody who thinks you're just reading a book about miracles has not played with Lewis in metaphysics. He's just at his, how do I describe it? He's just very good at describing the thought process that goes behind our own works, almost in a presupposition kind of way, which is interesting. The worldview. Is it our worldview that is informing the questions that we're asking, or are we actually allowing the questions that we're asking to affect our worldview? Is it cyclical or is it a straight line? We play around with some of these things, but as far as my work as a pastor, fantasy literature is wonderful for this. It asks questions that we would never be able to ask as a normal person. Let me give you a quick example. A quick example would be a question that I asked our eighth graders, actually. If you were to talk about death, we would talk about the way that it affects us as people, the way that it affects those that we leave behind, our emotions, whether we're happy, whether we're sad. That's one way to look at it. What if we do it from the way that Tolkien looks at it? So, for example, we have elves. Elves are effectively immortal. Fantasy literature helps consider what death and immortality really looks like from a people that never die.
Yeah.
And it just changes the perspective just a little bit.
Yeah, it does. It does. And when the elves go to war, they're risking something that, like, they're risking more than the humans going to war, because the humans are going to die.
Yeah, in Tolkien's mythology, humans go, they're pretty much gone. Elves will pretty much be reincarnated as best as Tolkien's mythology allows, over and over and over and over and over and over. Then you get to the story in the Silmarillion of Beren and Luthien.
Oh, yeah.
And you hear of an elf who suddenly experiences something that no other elf has ever experienced. How do we deal with death if we are a people set as Christians to never die? And those are the kind of questions that fantasy literature has a way of bringing to the forefront without us realizing it.
Wow. That's a great apologetic just for fantasy literature in general. How do you help kids who struggle reading The Lord of the Rings or Narnia here at Veritas? Because I know not every child jumps into everything and just loves it immediately. So how do you get them going in the right direction?
Other than jumping around and acting like the cheerleader that I tend to be, there's one thing to be said about being lively up front, is that you do tend to keep some attention up front.
That's true.
That being said, the first thing I do is I'm honest. And a lot of these students have interacted with Tolkien. In fact, you can't interact with fantasy literature, period, without addressing Tolkien. You might even write the opposite of Tolkien. The fact is you have to be consciously writing the opposite of Tolkien.
Sure.
You have to go through Tolkien to do anything in fantasy. But because of this, I'm able to ask the students, have you read or watched The Lord of the Rings? Who liked it? Who didn't like it?
Mm-hmm.
And I want them to be upfront and honest right at the back, because it's not everybody's cup of tea.
Yeah.
It's not. I wish it was.
Yeah.
The world would be perfect, potentially. I mean, we'd move a little closer to that kind of vision of it. But now, not every student likes it. So the first thing I would encourage is just be honest. Just be honest with the kind of literature that you like, because you can still not, just because it's not your cup of tea doesn't mean that there's not something to get there.
Eventually, it's good to like a bunch of kinds of tea.
Yeah. Exactly. Especially whenever you start with The Hobbit. The first 2-3 chapters of The Hobbit are very, they're lively, they're cutesy. I like adventure. I don't like adventure. Adventure's for terrible. No. And then you get to the council, or then
I think that part of it is in Lancaster County.
Yeah. That's a great analog. I like that. But then you get to Elrond and Rivendell.
Yeah.
And I told the students to keep an eye on that, and they all said, yeah, something changed. It's important for students to realize that just because they don't like something now, I'm a perfect example of that. I couldn't stand Beowulf in high school. I'll say that. It was a little rough. And Beowulf can be boring. And, there's kennings, which is pretty much what anybody remembers if they studied Beowulf at high school, if you're not careful. But, I mean, you have a monster He-Man guy ripping the arms off of a monster. This should be like fishing with dynamite to get kids invested in this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I think I had your same teacher for Beowulf.
Yeah, I don't know how we missed that mark.
Yeah. So, Paul, we're here at Veritas Academy, and we're a school that walks to the beat of a different drum a little bit. Maybe it's a little bit more than a different drum, but there's so much educational thought and educational importance placed on STEM stuff. And of course, it's not that we have a wonderful science program. We have half the students at Veritas get to second year calculus in high school. So it's not like we're diminishing those things in importance. But, our culture is one that looks at the humanities and the liberal arts and sometimes says, why would you waste all of this time on fantastic stories about talking animals and elves and towers falling and things like that, when you could just be diagramming more sentences and, making it to linear algebra instead? What would you say to a culture that is pointed in that direction or questioning why we invest at Veritas so much time in reading stories and talking about them?
A lot of the question seems to be a cart before the horse, or maybe it is a little circular. Lewis actually talks about this in Mere Christianity and Miracles. At least he answers it in a different way. Why should you be unselfish? Well, so that way because you should care more about others. Well, that's just describing unselfishness again.
Yeah. That's
not getting around to the problem. And yet, as people, we instinctively know that. One of the things that I think is missing whenever we skip out on some of these great books, I mean, our 7th graders are reading the histories of Rome with Livy. I never did anything like that. I didn't do that until I was an adult and boring. But it's important because without it, I believe that we're very much in danger of thinking we are more important than anyone else.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think that if we skip the great books, I mean, of course, we're automatically saying that they're not that great, not just in size, not just in scope, but they really don't have anything to teach us.
You can have a great life. You can have a good life without them.
Yeah, and in some cases that's true, but can you have a good society, which is what a lot of these great books were dealing with?
So how would Lewis answer that question? If you want to, can you channel some inner Clives?
Some of the best stuff that you can see Lewis do this is in his least read works. For example, his English literature of the 16th century, excluding drama.
Okay.
Which is like part of the Oxford series, literature classics. I mean, nobody reads this book unless you know that C.S. Lewis wrote it. Shakespeare without Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
You get a sense of where we're coming from, but also that it can actually, and it's not just about application, it's about the way that we apply our minds to those places where we've been.
Yeah.
We are always standing on the shoulders of giants. We have to acknowledge that. If we miss the fact and we think that we're standing on our own 2 feet, then we really have hit the height of hubris.
Yes. Yeah. And what happens after hubris? The fall,
Yeah.
right? Like it's when you go back and read Lewis or Tolkien, or you go back and you read Dante or Homer, what you know as you dig deeper and deeper into these works is you're not that smart. Like and you can't think that all the smart people in the world are just the ones alive today.
Not only that, we're so likely to repeat errors. And I don't just mean the practical errors. We're guilty of thinking that we actually have original thoughts that no one has ever considered before. There's a reason why all the old heresies come around like all the old fashions do every 30 years or so.
Yeah.
They seem to go in cycles, and that's just our human minds. If we don't trust other people, we are just guilty of just jaw-dropping pride. One of the best examples I can give you is actually from Chesterton in his opening of Orthodoxy. Whenever he, to summarize it, what he says is, if you would like to see a place where a person trusts themselves and only themselves implicitly, I can show you where that is. And I think you remember this part. And he points him over to the asylum.
Ah.
And I found that to be so staggering.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. In a culture that says, trust yourself, trust your instincts. If you follow that to its logical conclusion, we call that insanity.
So if you want to give some advice to parents, these are books that you can read with pretty young kids, and they're going to understand them and love them at one level, and you don't really have to be worried that you're going to ruin that next level for them, because it's kind of as they mature, they're able to see, many people are able to see more deeply into what Lewis, the depth. And of course, when Michael Ward, when Planet Narnia came out, like, then you see, oh my goodness, there's a whole nother level.
Yeah.
Lewis is playing, you read it as a 7-year-old and you're thinking, oh, fun animal story. And then you see all of this deep Christian symbolism, and then you just keep on going down. And then you realize he's talking about the planets of the medieval sky. And man, so how can parents use these, help their kids enjoy and love, and maybe melt this into their family life?
The first piece of advice I would give anybody who's trying to introduce Narnia to kids is let it be a children's story. Our instinct, once you know that Aslan is Jesus, the evangelical desire just bubbles up and you just want to tell everybody about everything that's there. Let it linger.
Yeah.
Let it just
That's
dangle
really
there.
good. That's really good, Paul.
Let them be kids for a little bit. Let them enjoy a talking lion and 2 talking beavers and a wardrobe that they can look at and play with and have a ton of fun with. There is plenty of time for them to mature in their Christianity. And I don't know of anybody who reads Narnia to a 4-year-old who immediately tries to bring them into Calvin's Institutes immediately after. And yet we try to do that because part of it is we're very zealous for Christ.
Yeah.
And we should be. And I love that. But there's a prudence that needs to go into that about, are they equipped to enjoy this at the level that I am?
Yeah.
And often they're not.
Yeah. And thankfully,
Yeah.
I the first time I read Narnia, I was alone. I didn't have any guides around me. I had a lot of evangelicals around me, but they weren't guiding me through Narnia. and that meant that the second or third time through Narnia, I get to have that moment of, this is about the gospel, right? That's a powerful time. So we started talking about books that would be read 500 years from now. And I wanted to pivot back around to that and just say, I've always thought, I don't think that Narnia and the Lord of the Rings, holds up to the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Divine Comedy or something like that. But I think that if Lewis and Tolkien are read 500 years from now, some of it's because their story is so wonderful, but I think a lot of it is because they in some ways turned the tide of Christian imagination in the early 20th century, when Christianity was really real, authentic, orthodox, Bible-believing Christianity was in full retreat.
Yeah.
And really the hope of, they see the end of the modern world, or the beginning of the end of the modern world, in the fields of battle in World War I. And they come off, thankfully, both of them survive, right? And they come off that field and they reignite the Christian imagination. And so many rocks have joined the avalanche from those two men kicking a few rocks down a hill. So I don't know. I don't know. I kind of think that Lewis and Tolkien would be my second choice behind Austen for what's going to be read 500 years from now.
I would hope so. Am I that optimistic? Maybe not, but yet they have something else going for them that is often not as talked about as others. I mean, I mentioned Mere Christianity. Those are his apologetics works for Lewis. Tolkien and Lewis were scholars on top of things.
Yes.
If you are going to read, say, Beowulf, I mean, Tolkien, even if Tolkien had never written anything about the Hobbits or Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion, he would still be read today, granted on a much smaller scale because of his Beowulf studies.
Yeah.
Same thing with Lewis, and there was no better John Milton scholar of the 20th century, possibly ever, even before him. And he is still, as I understand it, read in Milton studies, if there are such a thing. So, as I said, I know it breaks my heart too.
I'm hurting.
Yeah, no, I say that as somebody in pain myself on it. So in some sense, their academic lives would still continue to serve as a pointer to their personal lives. If somebody wanted to say, this man who wrote the preface to Paradise Lost that I'm reading in John Milton studies from 1,000 years ago at that point, 500 years from now, 1,000 years, what was he like? That might ignite a little bit of interest in the same way, and this actually goes off of our pre-recording, the same way that Albertus Magnus, the great teacher of Thomas Aquinas, is only probably talked about because his student was so brilliant.
Well, and I thank you, Paul. Thanks for coming in and being part of this podcast. Thanks for being the Albertus Magnus to those little Thomas Aquinas running around the hallway here at Veritas.
Oh no!
So yeah, I don't know, for a Methodist minister, I'm not sure that's a great analogy.
Hey, I take it as a compliment.
There
if
you
it
go.
Happens.
There you go. There you go. So thank you so much, and thank you for stirring up the loves of our children for these wonderful Christian authors, Lewis and Tolkien. Thank you.
No, this has been my privilege, and I hope that, if nothing else, these kids that we have here today will share this love, some of the lessons that they've learned about Lewis, about Tolkien, about even the other great books that they're reading here. And whenever their own teachers scare them away from Beowulf, they'll be able to pull them back and say you're missing something.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Paul.
No, my privilege.
You've been listening to Cultivate, the podcast of Veritas Academy, a preschool through 12th grade classical Christian school in Leola, Pennsylvania. If you would like to learn more about Veritas, please visit veritasacademy.com to discover the truth, beauty, and goodness of classical Christian education.